There was a show popular a few years ago on Netflix that was about life in Northern Ireland in the 90s for a group of teenage girls. It was an interesting premise because the girls were living during that time they call the Troubles, which is when the Catholics and the Protestants were in a violent struggle for the soul of the country back in the 90s. And so there is a scene in that show that's very picturable for all of us here. It was an all-girls Catholic school coming together for the day with an all-boys Protestant school. And the purpose was simple. It was a day of retreat to help them break down barriers and get along a little better, develop some understanding for each other. And so it was a typical retreat format. You know, they were going to have discussion groups and maybe trust falls and ropes courses, things like that. So there was a scene where the facilitator has the boys and the girls there in this auditorium and says, let's make a list of all the things we have in common. And a scribe came forward with chalk at the chalkboard, and they're making a list of all the things they have in common. And it wasn't going well. They couldn't think of anything that they had in common, not a single thing. And so a typical teacher move would be to pick one of your star students and just ask them. They'll surely know an answer. So he said, Erin, what about you? What would you say? And she said, I'm not coming up with anything. I don't know if there's anything we have in common. So then one student gets brave and says, well, I guess Protestants tend to be English and Catholics tend to be Irish. And the facilitator said, that's a difference. We're making a list of the similarities. Let's try again. Can we make a list of the similarities? Somebody else raises their hand. Protestants are kind of rich and Catholics tend to be poor. Well, that's a difference. That's an example of a difference. Another hand goes up. Catholics seem to buzz off statues and Protestants not so much. They don't get it. And so they couldn't come up with a single thing that they had in common. These two groups that live in the same country, that look the same, and are different denominations of the same religion. That is so often how it is for us. When we're comparing ourselves to someone else, we don't see what's similar. We see what's different. I don't know if you've ever gone to an ecumenical service, one of those services we'll have in town, sometimes at Thanksgiving time, sometimes for a special event like a stand for peace or something like that. And we go with great intentions, and we're a little bit embarrassed sometimes at how out of sorts we feel when it doesn't go exactly the way that it goes at our church. When the song that they're singing just sounds awfully, I don't know, kind of Protestant, you know, it's a little bit Protestant sounding. We don't sing like that, or, you know, or we'll say, let's say the prayer that unites us all. Give us this day our daily bread and forgive us our debts, trespasses, debts. There's this dissonance. We say different words. We get to deliver us from evil, and the Protestants keep going, while the Catholics look in the program, for thine is the kingdom and the power. That's what happens. And we can get over-focused on those differences and ignore the similarities that are there underneath. Past generations were even more focused on the differences than we are. My mom went to Catholic school in the 1950s in Troy, and she was taught something that many of you who went to Catholic schools in that era were taught, that we should pray for our Protestant neighbors because they could not go to heaven. And my mother had a dear friend down the street who was Protestant, and she was anguished and cried herself to sleep a number of nights over that. So now imagine what a change it was 20 years later when my mom gets married to a Protestant boy she met at college, and how she had to work through whatever made them different and try to find the similarities there. My Protestant grandparents were very, very dear to me, but I think they did sometimes have to swallow hard when they were hanging out with the Catholic branch of the family. If they ever came to church with us, or if we said grace before meals, there was something about it that they were very polite, but you could tell that to them it felt a little I don't know, maybe culty or something like that. Those differences are hard on people. And if it was that hard 20 years ago or 50 years ago, just imagine how hard it was 2,000 years ago in Israel for people in Jesus' time. So that's what the story is about today. It's about one of those moments when a Canaanite woman wants the help of Jesus. And the difference between Jewish and Canaanite is way more different than Protestant and Catholic. She's from a completely different religion. And in Jesus' time, they would be considered worshiping false gods. They didn't acknowledge the God of Jesus. And so there was these big, big differences. And there were religious laws that prevented Jesus, a single man, from even talking to this woman. So the barrier between them was great. So Jesus begins when she addresses him by following the rule and respecting the barrier. He just ignores her because he's not allowed to talk to her. But she keeps calling out. And then he says something shocking. He says, I can't help you. I'm in charge of the children of Israel, and your people are the dogs. Ooh. This is an important scene in Scripture. It really gets our attention. Even someone who's only half listening says, whoa, wait a minute. Can we rewind that for a second? What happened there? Why would the Son of God do that? Now, here's what I would say. This is a big point of inquiry for theologians, and they've been spilling ink on this topic for 2,000 years. So we're not going to leave here today with a perfectly full understanding, except I think we can say this. The thing we're noticing is that Jesus changes from the beginning of the story to the end. When the woman says, Jesus, come on, he immediately responds. So what we are seeing here is a story about the Son of God changing, starting off one way in the story and leaving the story a different way. How could that be possible? How could the Son of God change? Well, that's why it's important to turn back to the first reading and realize this is not a change for God. The first reading from the prophet Isaiah, from before the time of Jesus, says, my house is for all people. I welcome all people without distinctions. I am not excluding anyone. So we know that God has had the mindset that all are welcome from the beginning. So this is where we get a real clear look into what it means for Jesus to be 100% divine and at the same time 100% human. He's not a hybrid. He's not a 50-50 mix. He's 100% of each. And so, although we can't fully understand that this side of heaven, we understand that humans have pressure to stay in their groups. And humans only come to understanding things by learning. So let's go back to my mom in the 50s. If my mother in the 50s had the kind of pressure she had, just imagine how much pressure was on Jesus. Imagine how difficult that moment was. Mother Teresa was once asked by a reporter, Mother Teresa, you deal with so many hardships. What do you think is the biggest problem in the world? I wonder how you would answer that. If you were to just pause for a second, what do you think is the biggest problem in the world? She said, the biggest problem in the world is that we draw the circle of our family too small. We only include in our family the people who have our name or look like us or are part of our group, part of our religion. She said, we're never going to get anywhere if we can't learn to draw the circle of our family larger. So this is interesting. Jesus in this gospel is teaching us about the biggest problem in the world. And the way he taught us about life was by dying. And the way he's teaching us about unity is by learning. The Canaanite woman says to Jesus, "The circle of my family is big enough to include you. Can the circle of your family be big enough to include me?" And as soon as she says it, he says, "Woman, great is your faith." Jesus is 100% God and also 100% human. And humans learn. And learning is something that Jesus is inviting us to see modeled in him. This week, it would be interesting for us to answer the question for ourselves. Who does the circle of our family include? Is there anybody missing from the circle of our family that maybe belongs there? Do you have anyone in the circle of your family that supports a different political candidate than you do? Do you have anyone in that circle who's not Catholic or maybe not religious at all? Is there anybody in there who's got a different skin color or speaks a different first language? A lot of theologians believe that the reason this story is in the Bible is simply because Jesus is humble and he wants to model humility. And just as he allowed himself to be stripped before us and killed, he's allowing us to hear this embarrassing story on a Sunday morning. Kind of like the story of him being angry in the temple or wandering away from his parents when he was 12. He's allowing us to hear all about him so that we can learn how to learn. And that's how he's helping us to address the biggest problem in the world and help every one of us draw the circle of our family just a little bit larger.